What would you do if the woman in rubber gloves, the one who mopped floors for 17 years, turned out to be the very person who once wrote the original code of ethics for an $800 million corporation? No one knew her name. No one ever asked what she needed. She worked quietly, showed up on time, made no mistakes. But to them, she was just the cleaner, a faint shadow in the background of a grand picture, until a 14-second audio clip leaked. Just 14 seconds. Yet enough to throw an entire board of directors into crisis. Enough to trigger a 3 a.m. call from a major shareholder, and enough that 2 months later, the entire private healthcare sector of California began a sweeping review of its internal oversight systems. All because of one woman that no one bothered to look at twice. But she didn't retaliate. She didn't accuse. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked up to a trash can in the industrial kitchen and asked one question. "Excuse me, where's the bin?" No one answered. But 10 days later, those who ignored her were asked to step down. And that woman, in her faded janitor's uniform, was invited to sit at the strategic roundtable where million-dollar decisions were made. Today, you'll hear the full story, told in real time, based on actual events inside a healthcare conglomerate that once led the market in revenue, but nearly lost its soul. This is not a story about a CEO. It's not about money. It's about something deeper, something most of us lose when work becomes just a transaction. It's about dignity. And the question is, can any system truly function if it forgets how to respect the quietest person in the room? Julian Mercer never truly understood his mother's strength until one afternoon when he was 12 years old. He came home early from school and saw her kneeling on the bathroom floor of a private hospital, rubber gloves on her hands, scrubbing stains from the tiled floor while softly humming a tune. The melody wasn't for entertainment, it was a shield, something to keep her steady in a world where the dignity of a poor black woman was almost invisible. From behind a slightly ajar door, Julian stood frozen. In that moment, he didn't see a weak mother. He saw a warrior. Ruth Mercer was a woman who didn't believe in complaining. She didn't have time to. Her husband had died of a stroke when Julian was just 5, leaving her alone with a child and a pile of bills. No wealthy relatives, no life insurance, no social safety net. Just calloused hands and a hardened heart. She worked every job she could find, washing dishes, babysitting, caring for the dying, cleaning homes, anything to pay the rent and buy textbooks for her son. But there was one rule Ruth always kept. Never let Julian see her in despair. So she sang. They lived in a rundown apartment in the suburbs of Atlanta, where the walls were peeling and the heater barely worked. But every corner of the house had books. Ruth didn't buy makeup or go to hair salons, but she gladly spent money on an advanced 6th-grade math book for Julian when he was only in 3rd grade. "I can't teach you algebra," she once told him, "but I can clean 2 extra houses a week to buy you the book to learn it." For Ruth, raising a child wasn't a duty, it was a mission. Julian grew up with the scent of bleach in his clothes, with evenings when his mother came home late and left a sandwich for him in the microwave. But he also grew up with a strange and unshakable belief in his own potential. While other kids obsessed over video games, Julian tinkered with code. He taught himself Python using library books and downloaded free programming software onto the old laptop his mother bought from a flea market. The screen was cracked, but he called it "my first AI." Ruth didn't understand what code was, but every time she saw her son staring at the screen and smiling, she felt like she'd won another battle in an invisible war. In 10th grade, Ruth was diagnosed with a spinal condition after years of standing jobs. The doctor recommended she stop working, but Ruth just scoffed. "If I stop, who's going to send my son to college?" Then she switched to night shifts. Better pay, fewer people, double the exhaustion. Julian cried that night, but Ruth simply wiped his tears and said, "Just keep studying. Don't let tears blur your screen." That line was etched in Julian's memory forever. With straight A's, a statewide science award, and an admissions essay that stunned the Stanford Selection Committee, Julian received a full scholarship in biomedical engineering. The day the acceptance letter arrived, Ruth said nothing. She hugged him, then walked into the bathroom, closed the door, and cried in silence. They weren't tears of weakness. They were the tears of a mother who knew her sacrifices had borne fruit. At Stanford, Julian developed an AI application that could detect early-stage breast cancer using blood test data. What began as a classroom paper quickly attracted attention from a medical research center. With a few like-minded peers, Julian launched Mercer Labs, a small startup that began with a borrowed lab space and 3 old laptops. But what Julian had, and no one else could replicate, was the fire born from a woman who had spent her life on her knees so her son could stand tall. Mercer Labs grew faster than expected. They received grants from science foundations, followed by angel investors. In an interview with Forbes, when asked who inspired him most, Julian didn't hesitate. My mother. She saved more lives than I have. She just never wore a white coat. The quote went viral on social media, and for the first time, Ruth received letters from strangers calling her the mother of the 21st century. But with the spotlight came shadows. When Mercer Labs unveiled their AI algorithm that could detect cancer cells with 96% accuracy, they instantly became targets for acquisition by massive healthcare conglomerates. One of them was Ashcroft Health Systems, a corporate empire led by Maxwell Ashcroft, infamous for swallowing up young medical tech companies. Maxwell called Julian directly. His voice was smooth, polite. He invited Julian to Newport Beach, his private family estate, for a more in-depth conversation about a deal that could reshape the future of medicine. Julian was cautious at first until he heard the number, $800 million. More than that, Maxwell said, if we partner, you'll have the resources to bring medical AI to every corner of America, even the places where your mother once worked 16-hour days without health insurance. The words hit a tender spot, straight at the heart of a devoted son. Julian agreed to go, but on one condition, that his mother could come with him. Ruth resisted at first. I don't belong at fancy parties with rich folks, she said. Julian just smiled. No one belongs in injustice, Mom, but we're going, on our own terms. He hired a stylist to help her pick a simple, elegant navy blue dress, booked first-class tickets, reserved a suite in a 5-star hotel. For the first time in her life, Ruth walked into a place where someone opened the door and bowed as she entered, but she still felt out of place, not with the setting, but with the way people looked at her. On the night of the party, as the limousine pulled up to the gates of the Ashcroft estate, Ruth squeezed her son's hand tightly. Julian turned to her and said, "Remember what you told me? Don't let your tears blur your screen?" Ruth nodded and tried to smile. Julian replied, "Then tonight, don't let the lights make you forget who you are. You're the reason I'm here." The gates opened. The party was ready, but no one inside knew that the modest guest in the navy blue dress was the reason an $800 million deal would never be signed. The tiny kitchen of the third-floor East Lake apartment, once where Ruth Mercer prepared cheap but nutritious meals for the two of them, had become the place where Julian wrote the first line of code that would change his life. The second-hand laptop sat beside the sink, always damp from the steam, but it was the only quiet space when his mother was working. And it was right there, at the age of 13, that Julian created an application to check body temperature using a webcam after watching his mother go to work with a fever because she couldn't afford a thermometer. No one guided him. No one understood what he was doing, but Ruth always believed. "What are you building, honey?" she once asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "A tool so you don't have to guess if you're sick or not." Ruth just looked at him, didn't understand it all, but when she saw the light in his eyes, she smiled. "Then I guess I don't need health insurance anymore, huh?" At Stanford, Julian was like a fish in water. He immersed himself in machine learning models, biological simulation problems, and especially artificial intelligence applied to medical diagnostics. In one group project, he proposed developing an AI capable of detecting early signs of ovarian cancer using protein markers in blood samples, an idea that, at the time, still felt far-fetched. The supervising professor didn't hide his surprise. "This is something major labs are working on, with million-dollar budgets." Julian simply nodded. "I have something they don't. A reason." That reason was Ruth, the woman who skipped dinner 3 nights a week to save money for his programming lessons. The woman who refused spinal surgery because I can handle the pain as long as you don't get a headache while studying. When Mercer Labs was born, it wasn't the result of a polished business plan, but the byproduct of a deep internal drive. Julian and two friends, Maya and Kendrick, rented an old lab space from a retired doctor on the outskirts of Palo Alto. They slept in the lab, lived on instant noodles, and used Julian's laptop as a makeshift server. Ruth called every night to ask, "Are you eating? Sleeping? Is anyone giving you a hard time?" Julian always answered, "I'm okay. We're figuring out how to detect malignant cells in ultra-small samples, still using the algorithm I wrote myself." Ruth stayed quiet, then said only, "Keep your back straight. When you do something good, keep your head up too." In its first year, Mercer Labs had no clients. They only had simulated data and a few academic contacts. But in the second year, a hospital in San Jose agreed to test their AI for breast tissue analysis. The results were surprising. Mercer's AI detected 3 early-stage positive cases that the current screening systems had missed. The news spread quickly in the medical community. TechMed Weekly called them the 3-person team taking on a billion-dollar industry. Health AI magazine headlined, "Stanford alumni use AI to save lives and might just save America's healthcare too." With increasing volumes of data, Mercer Labs upgraded the algorithm, naming it CORE, Cognitive Oncology Risk Evaluator. CORE didn't just analyze, it learned. With every new case, it refined its sensitivity. Within 6 months, CORE reached an accuracy of 96.3%, outperforming the diagnostic systems used in over 400 hospitals. A small healthcare insurance firm in Oregon became their first official client. Money started coming in, but Julian didn't upgrade offices or buy a new car. He just mailed an envelope home to his mother, containing a card. Lifetime health care, premium plan, Ruth Mercer. Ruth called and asked, "What did you do?" Julian answered, "I just want you to never have to choose between buying medicine or paying the electric bill again." News about Mercer Labs reached Maxwell Ashcroft during an internal strategy meeting. A vice president of technology presented that CORE was being piloted in hospitals and, if integrated early, could save millions annually. Maxwell said nothing, tapping his fingers on the table. After the meeting, he told his personal assistant to call Julian. The invitation wasn't just for strategic partnership discussions, but also to talk about the future of medicine from a creator's perspective. Julian took the call while cleaning out lab trash. "Ashcroft," he repeated, "I thought they only cared about companies already making hundreds of millions." That evening, Maxwell called back, this time himself. The voice was calm, each word deliberate. "Julian, the people who change the world don't wait for revenue milestones. They set trends, and we know when to catch up." The last line sounded like a promise or a warning. Maxwell invited Julian to Newport Beach, the unofficial headquarters of the Ashcroft family, a mansion where their biggest deals were sealed over glasses of wine. "Bring your mother," he said. "I want to meet the woman who raised a genius." Julian was slightly surprised but didn't object. He thought, if this is the road to changing the medical field, a field where his mother was once denied care for lacking insurance, then he had to walk it, even if cautiously. Ruth agreed to go after 3 days of convincing. Julian hired a personal stylist to help her choose an elegant dress, not too flashy, but sophisticated enough. They flew business class, stayed in a hotel overlooking the sea, and the whole time Julian reminded his mother, "You don't have to try to fit in. You're the reason I'm there. They need to adjust to you, not the other way around." Ruth chuckled but still felt uneasy. "You know," she whispered on the ride to the mansion, "I've never been invited to a place where the menu doesn't list prices." As the car pulled up to the grand gate, Julian squeezed her hand. He remembered the hundreds of times she had walked into someone else's house through the back door, mop bucket in hand. Today she walked through the front door, head held high, leather purse in hand, and eyes that didn't shy away from anyone. What he didn't know was that very gaze would become a thorn in the side of those used to controlling everything, except dignity. The party began like any other high society event: wine, string quartet, and practiced smiles. Ruth stood beside her son, returning polite greetings from a few and cold stares from others. Maxwell approached, shook Julian's hand, and bowed lightly to Ruth. "An honor," he said, though his eyes flicked sideways toward his wife, Eleanor, standing behind him. Eleanor said nothing, just offered a faint smile. Preston, Maxwell's son, raised an eyebrow at Ruth and then leaned toward his friends, chuckling quietly. Ruth noticed. She had seen that look her entire life. A server approached, offering a tray of wine to Ruth. She shook her head, about to decline, when the server leaned in and whispered, "Ma'am, these people are really picky. Make sure the glasses are lined up perfectly." Ruth froze. Julian didn't hear it, but when he saw the look on his mother's face, he began to sense something was wrong. He was about to ask, but she nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," she said, just like she always had. But inside, Ruth was not fine. And what she didn't yet know was, this was only the beginning of an evening that America would later remember as a symbol of honor restored by intellect. No one said it aloud, but everyone noticed. Ruth Mercer didn't belong here. It wasn't because of how she dressed. Her navy blue dress was elegant, modest at the collar, paired with cream-colored low heels and neatly combed hair. It wasn't her demeanor either. Ruth was composed, gracious, smiling at the right times and nodding politely whenever someone spoke to her. The issue was her eyes, the eyes of someone who had once scrubbed floors beneath people like them and still stood upright beside them. In Maxwell Ashcroft's world, that was considered dangerous. Preston Ashcroft, Maxwell's son and a recent Wharton graduate, wore a white suit as if to silently declare, "I'm special." He approached Julian and Ruth, swirling wine in his glass. "So this is the mother of the great founder?" Preston said loudly, ensuring several guests could hear. "My mom used to say, behind every successful man is a clean kitchen." Some people laughed, not because it was clever, but because they were conditioned to laugh along with power. Julian froze. Ruth kept smiling. "Preston, isn't it? I heard you're good at risk analysis. I hope you also know that the greatest risk is misjudging others." The response was soft but so sharp that Preston couldn't force a laugh. Julian looked at his mother, a mix of admiration and unease in his eyes. He knew it was going to be a long night. The party went on. Maxwell guided Julian through introductions to potential investors, men who held major stakes in healthcare technology firms. Meanwhile, Ruth was left in the lounge area, where a group of wealthy women, wives of CEOs, major shareholders, and politicians, were chatting. Eleanor Ashcroft, Maxwell's wife, stood at the center like a queen. When Ruth approached, one of them asked, "Do you work at Mercer Labs?" Ruth nodded. "No, I'm Julian's mother." The group fell silent for a few seconds before Eleanor smiled. "Oh, then I suppose you know more about MOPS than AI algorithms, huh?" Laughter followed, but Ruth said nothing. She looked directly at Eleanor. "You're right. I don't know much about algorithms, but I do know how to spot trash, even when it's wrapped in velvet." The line wasn't loud, but it rippled through the room like a shockwave. A female chef nearby, prepping hors d'oeuvres, let out a quiet chuckle. A senior butler standing near the door nodded slightly. They understood Ruth. They recognized that look. But to those women, Ruth had just violated an unspoken rule. Someone like her was supposed to be humble, agreeable, and know her place. That she dared to answer back, to meet their gaze without flinching, was unacceptable. Meanwhile, Julian was listening as Maxwell laid out the merger plan. "We'll invest $300 million into Mercer Labs in exchange for 51% ownership. You'll retain operational control, but strategic direction will follow our model: rapid scaling, selling analytical data to insurance partners, and making core the mandatory diagnostic standard in all Ashcroft Health-affiliated hospitals." Julian asked, "What about providing free AI to community hospitals?" "We're running a trial in New Mexico." Maxwell shrugged. "Good for PR, but financially unsustainable. You've got vision, Julian. Don't waste it on places without budgets." His voice was low but firm, like an adult explaining the world to a naive child. Julian felt a chill. He remembered the nights his mother came home, legs shaking, back aching, just to save enough for his education. He recalled her words, "Justice doesn't come from the top. It comes from patience at the bottom." He looked at Maxwell. "And what if I say no?" Maxwell sipped his wine. You'll face pressure from the board, and you'll be alone. But don't worry, we know how to help bright young minds understand what's good for them. It wasn't a threat, it was simply a fact in their world. Julian returned to the lounge to find his mother. He saw Ruth sitting alone on a leather chair, gazing into the distance, the white cleaning gloves still tucked in her purse, a quiet symbol of a past she had never denied. He approached and took her hand. "Are you okay, Mom?" Ruth nodded. "I'm fine. Just missing my old kitchen. Back there, you never had to ask permission to tell the truth." Julian understood. He knew the price of the deal wasn't in the numbers. It was in the silence it demanded in the face of everything his mother had endured. And if he signed this contract, it meant accepting that people like Ruth would never be allowed in decision-making rooms, unless they wore janitor uniforms. A staff member approached. "Mr. Ashcroft would like to invite both of you to the private room for further discussion." Julian nodded, but as they walked, Ruth squeezed his hand. "If they want you to sell your soul, don't let them give me a new dress just to ease your conscience." Julian smiled, but his heart felt heavy. In the private room, just Maxwell, Julian, and Ruth, there was no music, no wine, only numbers, clauses, and scrutinizing eyes. Maxwell began, "Mrs. Mercer, I must say, you've raised a genius, but for him to truly grow, you'll need to let him fly. And that means keeping emotion out of logic." Ruth replied gently, "I agree. Logic tells me, if someone wants to buy 51% of my son's company in just 2 years, then my son is doing something right." Maxwell slowed down. He didn't like being challenged. "I expected to meet a mother who was touched, grateful to be invited into this world. But it seems you came to teach us a lesson." Ruth looked him in the eye. "No. I came to see whether those at the top remember who held the ladder for them to climb." No one said a word. Julian placed his hand on the contract folder, then pushed it aside. "I'll think about it. But if I do sell the company, my first condition is, CORE must remain free for all community hospitals, and my mother will hold a seat on the project's clinical ethics board." Maxwell froze. "She doesn't have credentials." Julian replied, "She has experience, and that's the only credential I trust." The meeting ended without a signature, but as Ruth left, a longtime butler who had worked for the Ashcroft family for 30 years whispered to her, "Thank you, ma'am. No one said that out loud in years." Ruth simply smiled, then turned back to look at Maxwell, the man in the white suit, not with resentment, but with the gaze of someone who understands. No expensive suit can cover up cowardice. The party ended as the last champagne glasses were cleared from the tables. But the aftertaste it left behind wasn't the glamour of chandeliers or the soothing sound of violins. It was the uncomfortable silence between three people, Julian, Ruth, and Maxwell. After the private meeting ended without a signed deal, Julian declined the merger offer and left the Ashcroft estate in a car, without a driver, without an escort. Ruth sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. The next morning, Ruth returned to Mercer Labs headquarters in Fremont. She dressed simply, carrying a small fabric tote. In it were her familiar rubber gloves. No one paid attention as she entered through the employee side entrance. They assumed she was cleaning staff arriving early to mop the first-floor hallway. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Ruth wasn't there to play the boss, wasn't there to inspect, and certainly not to draw attention. She stepped into the staff kitchen, where the lingering smell of old coffee and burnt toast still clung. A young kitchen worker named Miguel was busy wiping down a table. He greeted her without knowing who she was. Ruth smiled. "Do you know where the trash bin is?" Miguel pointed to the corner of the room. Ruth nodded, walked over, lifted the lid, and dropped in a small bag containing a few cookie wrappers and a folded piece of paper, the note Julian had left her the night before. She no longer needed to keep it because she knew her son had chosen the right side. At that very moment, on the 5th floor, in the engineering conference room, Julian stood in front of the entire technical team. His face was more resolute than usual. "I declined the merger with Ashcroft. We're going to continue developing CORE independently. It'll be hard, very hard, but none of you are here to write code for people who've never set foot in a community ER." There was a smattering of quiet applause, but there were worried glances too. Everyone knew. Turning down Ashcroft meant rejecting the largest funding offer they'd ever received. Julian looked around and continued, I need you not just as engineers. I need you as people who still believe in why we started this. Downstairs, Ruth opened the fridge, took out some nut butter, spread it on a dry piece of toast, and placed it on a plate as if she were in her old kitchen. Another staff member, Trina, walked in and hesitated. You are? Ruth smiled. I'm Julian's mother. And you can call me Ruth. Trina nodded, then asked, What brings you here today? Ruth didn't answer right away. She simply pointed at a stack of unwashed glasses in the sink. I think these need someone to clean them, and I've never believed that job was beneath anyone. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Trina walked over, grabbed another towel, and began washing glasses alongside Ruth. In that little kitchen, two women, one who had been dismissed because of her past, and one being underestimated because of her position, stood side by side, cleaning glassware and chatting about how to remove stubborn grease. No one filmed it. No one turned it into content. But it was more real than any keynote speech. That afternoon, Julian came down to the staff cafeteria for lunch. He was surprised to see his mother sitting with three engineers and an elderly janitor named Lionel. They were laughing. Nothing dramatic, just a story about the time Ruth dropped an entire spice jar into a stock pot at her old restaurant job and accidentally invented three-layer flavor soup. Julian sat down, scooped some salad, and looked at his mom. How long do you plan to stay here? Ruth chewed slowly, then replied, Until people forget who I'm related to. Julian understood, and he let her do it, because he knew his mother never wanted to become a symbol. She wanted to live as a real person in real places, alongside the people society forgets first. But across the bay, in a cold glass building, Maxwell Ashcroft had not forgotten. He summoned an emergency meeting with his media advisors. That Mercer boy just turned down the best offer of his life, he said in a steady tone, and I don't like being turned down. One advisor asked, What do you want to do? Maxwell replied, What people like us always do. Ask the old question, Excuse me, where's the trash bin? But this time, don't ask politely. The very next day, an article appeared in a major tech publication. Mercer Labs rejects Ashcroft Health. Sign of poor vision? The article quoted an internal source claiming Core had a critical security flaw and that Julian Mercer was letting family emotions influence business decisions. Under the article were hundreds of comments, some agreeing, some defending, but most focused on the personal. What do you expect from a company run by a janitor's kid? Julian read the article in silence. Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder. You okay? Julian nodded. I'm okay, but I need to do something. He opened his laptop and called the in-house legal team. I want to know exactly who the internal source is, and I want to issue a response, not to defend ourselves, but to remind them. We don't build technology to be accepted. We build it to do what's right. At the same time, Lionel, the elderly janitor, walked into the engineering room holding a printed copy of the article. I've cleaned at 5 startups. Every time an article like this drops, it means someone's about to get fired. But this place feels different. He paused, looking around. I saw the founder of this company eating lunch with his mom, and his mom was washing dishes in the kitchen. If there's something wrong with this place, then maybe the world needs to relearn what right and wrong mean. That line spread like wildfire. A hashtag started popping up. Number sign code and cleaning gloves. No one planned it. No agency pushed it. It was just employees sharing stories. About the time Ruth taught them how to deodorize the fridge with orange peels, or how she once stood in the hallway to block a supervisor from yelling at a junior coder who cried after a bug error. Small things, but in the cold world of tech, they became big. Maxwell hadn't expected the backlash to backfire. He summoned Preston. You've interacted with Julian. What does he want? Preston replied, I think he just wants his mom to be treated like a human being. Maxwell scoffed. Well, that's easy. We just need to make her look like she's not one. A new plan began, but Ruth, the woman who once pushed a mop through the busiest diner in Fresno, was not easy to erase from the memories of those who had eaten her sandwiches. And Julian, the boy who once watched his mother stitch up every tear in his worn shoes, would not be taken down by polished words. When someone asks, "Excuse me, where's the trash bin?" sometimes the answer is, "In the place you thought you'd never have to look back at." Maxwell Ashcroft sat in the top floor office of Ashcroft Health's headquarters, staring out at the San Francisco Bay on a slightly foggy morning. In his hand was a newspaper reprint of Julian Mercer's latest interview. The headline stretched across the page, "We don't need money to do what's right." Beneath it, a quote from Julian himself. "Core is not for sale, not today, not until it reaches the communities that have always been left behind." Maxwell folded the paper, placed it on the desk, and pressed the intercom. "Schedule a meeting with the acquisitions team. We're increasing the offer." On the other end, his assistant asked, "How much, sir?" Maxwell replied simply, 800 million. No negotiation, no conditions. Meanwhile, at Mercer Labs, Ruth was sitting in the employee break room, using her personal computer to read feedback from a parent group in the Oakland community. One mother had written, "The Core insulin tracking app lets my child attend school all day without fearing a sugar crash. Thank you to your team." Ruth sat in silence for a few seconds, then switched to her second screen. An email from the in-house legal counsel addressed to Julian. The subject line read, "Ashcroft offered to acquire Mercer Labs for $800 million. Ruth didn't say a word. She just printed a copy and placed it on the small kitchen table, right where Julian usually sat each morning. Julian walked in a few minutes later, still holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He saw the paper, scanned it quickly, and sat down. Ruth remained silent, waiting for her son's reaction. But Julian asked just one simple question. "What do you think?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She poured more water into the kettle, then quietly said, "There are some things, once sold, can never be bought back. Like trust, like memory, like the reason we started." Julian nodded, saying nothing more, but his gaze grew heavier, because he knew $800 million wasn't just a number. It was a whisper from the entire system saying, everyone has a price. 3 days later, Julian attended a healthcare technology conference in San Jose. During his presentation, he announced, "Mercer Labs has declined an $800 million acquisition offer from Ashcroft Health." The room buzzed. He continued, "Not because we're overconfident, but because we understand too well what happens when a system that prioritizes profit above care takes control of something like Core. We chose the harder road." After the speech, a female medical student approached Julian, her eyes wide with inspiration. "Do you know this is the first time I've ever seen someone turn down $1 billion chance just to do the right thing?" Meanwhile, across town, Maxwell was not pleased. He replayed the recording of Julian's talk, skipping back to the phrase, "we declined," over and over. Then he turned to Preston. "He thinks this is about morals. It's about strategy. If we can't buy them, we make them lose trust. From the inside." Preston nodded quietly. "Where do we start?" Maxwell responded, "With the very people they claim to help." 2 days later, an anonymous article appeared on a blog focused on healthcare startups. It accused Core of collecting patient data without explicit consent. The article included a blurry image of what was labeled as a backdoor tracking system on an admin dashboard. Julian received the link while eating dinner at home with Ruth. He immediately called the tech team and ordered a full system audit. Within 36 hours, they confirmed that no backdoor existed, but the article had already spread like wildfire. Small investors began pulling out. Nonprofit partners asked to pause implementation for review. An internal email from the finance team read, "Without new funding in 90 days, we will need to lay off 25% of staff." Ruth heard the news but didn't appear afraid. She kept working, kept washing dishes, kept chatting with staff. But when it was just her and Julian in the back kitchen, she said, "This is the moment you answer the question. Is Core really not for sale, or has the price just not been high enough yet?" Julian was silent. He knew his mother wasn't doubting his values. She was testing his courage, because she, too, once had to choose between keeping a kind but failing restaurant or selling it to a corporation that would rename it and abandon the entire staff. She had chosen to lose everything, except the one thing money couldn't buy: dignity. And now it was Julian's turn. He called an all-company meeting. Standing before hundreds of anxious employees, he said, I know what's happening. I know some people think I was wrong to turn down $800 million. But if I sign away this company today to save it, then tomorrow it won't be Mercer Labs anymore. And everything my mother cleaned will be stained again by silence. The room was completely still. Then a young engineer raised their hand. So, what are you going to do? Julian replied, I'm going to reach out to the very community we serve. I'm going to tell them we're under threat by people who want to control health data like it's a product. And if they see value in what we're doing, they'll stand with us. Not with money, but with affirmation. A GoFundMe campaign was launched, not to fund a product, but to preserve the independent ownership model of Mercer Labs. Within 72 hours, the campaign had been shared over 120,000 times. And most surprising were the small contributions, $5, $10, from thousands of anonymous patients. An elderly patient wrote, I don't understand all the tech, but I know this app lets me check my heart rate without having to drive 40 miles to the nearest hospital. I don't want it to disappear. Ruth read every word, then looked at Julian. Now you know, some things don't need to be sold, because they've already been paid for with something greater than money. Trust. Julian nodded, but the campaign also stirred backlash. Analysts began to ask, should a health tech company be governed by people without financial stakes? Regulators demanded that Julian explain how community data was being handled. Some media outlets reported, GoFundMe campaign raises transparency concerns. Maxwell read the headlines and smirked. See, he told Preston, we don't need to break them from the outside. Just plant enough doubt. They'll collapse on their own. But what he didn't count on was a 17-second video. In the clip, Ruth Mercer is hand-washing her apron at the break room sink. An employee had casually recorded it and uploaded it with the caption, the founder's mom, still here every day, not as an owner who walked away, but as someone who kept her promise. The video spread across social media. No one asked for it. No one paid to promote it. But people shared it because it was real. And sometimes the truth doesn't need $800 million to be validated. It just needs a pair of rubber gloves and a mother unafraid to get her hands dirty. On Monday morning, Ruth was at Mercer Labs as usual, wearing her worn-down rubber gloves and holding a bottle of homemade cleaner mixed from an old recipe. The atmosphere in the office was tenser than usual. News of the GoFundMe campaign had helped Mercer Labs regain some trust from the community, but at the same time, it had also placed the company squarely in the crosshairs of the media and regulators. Ruth walked past a hallway lined with photos of communities CORE had supported. Indigenous children, elderly people of color, single mothers. She knew what her son needed now wasn't just a system, but a spirit. In the main conference room, Julian was meeting with the executive team. His face looked exhausted. They had just lost 2 major contracts with state-level hospitals due to lack of data compliance assurance. Some team members were beginning to question the decision to reject Ashcroft. They didn't say it out loud, but their eyes made it clear. We could have had $800 million? Julian nodded as he listened to the updates, then quietly said, all right, that's enough. I need an hour. He stood up and left the room before anyone could respond. Ruth happened to see her son walk past in the hallway. He didn't say a word, but something in his expression made her stop what she was doing. She removed her gloves and followed him. Julian stepped into the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and just left it sitting there. Ruth stood by the door, silent. After a while, Julian turned to her and asked, do you think I made a mistake? Ruth furrowed her brow. You're asking the wrong person. I never sold anything to get rich. I only ever sold food so people could stay alive. If that was wrong, then I've been wrong my whole life. Julian gave a faint smile, but it didn't lighten his burden. He said, I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Ruth didn't respond. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. A few hours later, Ruth returned to work as usual, wiping down the coffee counter. But just then, as she bent down to pick up a fallen rag, she slipped. Her back slammed into the edge of the table, and she collapsed to the floor. A loud thud startled 2 nearby employees, who ran over immediately. One shouted, call an ambulance. Mrs. Ruth fell. Julian was in a meeting when he got the call. He bolted downstairs, heart pounding. When he arrived, he saw his mother lying on her side, pale-faced, clutching her left side. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. Julian rode with her, her hand tightly gripping his, as if afraid of being left behind. At the hospital, doctors confirmed Ruth had fractured a rib. It wasn't life-threatening, but required close monitoring due to a slight fever. But what worried Julian more wasn't the fall itself. It was the way his mother looked at him while being wheeled into the emergency room, as if apologizing for making him worry. Julian sat in the cold, sterile hallway, surrounded by the sound of rolling gurneys and nurse calls, thinking back to the early days when he and his mother first started building Mercer Labs in that tiny Oakland kitchen. He remembered her trembling hands scrubbing grease off the old stove as she said, "We might not change the whole system, but at least let's not let it change us." At that very moment inside Ashcroft Health, Maxwell received an internal memo. Ruth Mercer involved in an accident at Mercer Labs HQ. Currently being treated at St. Joseph Hospital, Maxwell showed no reaction, aside from one sentence. "Good. That's the crack." Preston understood immediately. They would use the incident to fuel media suspicion that Mercer Labs allowed elderly workers to operate under unsafe conditions. The next day, an article appeared on a news portal. Elderly mother of Mercer Labs CEO slips on company premises, raising concerns over workplace safety standards. The story spread quickly. Readers were divided. Some expressed sympathy, others criticism. Julian read the article while sitting by his mother's hospital bed. Ruth, now conscious but weak, said only one thing. "Don't let them use my fall to make you forget why you get up every morning." Julian held her hand and softly replied, "I haven't forgotten, but I don't know what I'd do if I lost you." Ruth gave a tired smile. "You don't need me to remember what I taught you." Julian lowered his gaze, nodded, then stepped out into the hallway and called the legal team. He requested a press conference not to refute the story, but to tell it from Ruth herself, why she still worked every day, and why Mercer Labs had never been a place that exploited the elderly. 3 days later, Ruth appeared in a short live stream video from her hospital room. She said, "I wasn't forced to work. I'm not a symbol. I'm just a mother who sees her son doing what's right. And I don't want to stand on the sidelines. I don't work at Mercer Labs because they need me. I work because I need to believe there's a place where kindness isn't pushed out the door just because it's not profitable." The internet exploded. Comments poured in. "We believe you. We stand with Mercer Labs." This woman reminded me why I went into nursing. At Ashcroft, Maxwell threw his phone onto the desk. He muttered, "What the hell is this? A fall turns into a PR victory?" Preston calmly replied, "Looks like we underestimated the bond between the community and Ruth Mercer's image." Maxwell snapped, "No, we just underestimated the power of a real story." He turned his chair toward the window. "Then it's time to create a fake one, big enough to bury them." But while Ashcroft plotted their next move, Mercer Labs was undergoing a deeper transformation. After Ruth's accident, employees began asking themselves, "Why am I here?" A small group proposed creating the Ruth Mercer Internal Fund, designed to support any employee facing personal hardship but still committed to Mercer Labs' mission. The fund was established within a week, with voluntary contributions from 87% of staff. Julian had no idea until he saw the internal email. He froze for a few seconds, then broke down crying at his desk. And that's when he understood. His mother may have fallen, but the legacy she planted couldn't be shaken by an article. It had already taken root, and it was growing stronger every day, right inside the place Ashcroft thought would rot from the inside out. 3 days after Ruth was discharged from the hospital, the atmosphere at Mercer Labs had yet to return to normal. Although she had returned to the office, now working part-time and no longer handling sanitation duties, the staff still seemed haunted by the image of the woman in white, clutching her side, lying motionless in the hallway of a place everyone thought was safe. Ruth didn't want people to worry, but clearly the incident had left a mark that hadn't faded from Julian's mind. He stayed up later than usual, rarely smiled, and began rechecking every internal safety protocol. But not everything that happened that week stemmed from Ruth. Another event, quieter but far more consequential, was waiting to be triggered. On Thursday afternoon, while Ruth was gently wiping down tables in the staff lounge, a task she insisted on keeping because doing something makes me feel like I haven't been sidelined. She noticed a small USB stick lying beneath a long bench by the window. It had dust along the edges, suggesting it had been there for a while. Ruth picked it up, intending to place it in the lost and found box near reception. But something made her stop. The label on the USB was faded, but one capital letter was still legible. C. No one in the room had a name starting with C. Her instincts told her not to hand this USB to anyone, at least not until she knew what it contained. Ruth took the USB home. She didn't tell Julian. That night, after waiting for her son to fall asleep, she opened her personal laptop, an old machine, but still functional, and plugged it in. The screen displayed a single folder, not for press. Ruth clicked it. Inside was a series of PDFs and videos, all with cryptic titles: Internal Ashcroft Compliance 2022, Patient Reclassification Model, PR Spin Ruth Mercer Accident. She opened the last file first. It was an internal meeting recording, apparently at Ashcroft. A middle-aged male voice spoke coldly. If we frame Ruth Mercer's accident as emblematic of operational negligence, public attention will shift away from the human story. A younger voice chuckled. We'll redefine what care means. Ruth couldn't take her eyes off the screen. She opened the next file titled Patient Reclassification Model. It was a presentation slide detailing a plan to reclassify patients, a sterile euphemism for deprioritizing treatment for patients deemed unprofitable when Ashcroft took over a hospital. Ruth's hands trembled. With every second, she could hear the silent cries of the invisible, elderly, unhoused people of color, pushed aside simply because they didn't generate revenue. The next morning, Ruth didn't go to the office. She called in to request the day off. Julian was worried but respected her decision. At the same time, Ruth visited an old friend, Lydia Chang, a retired investigative journalist with deep connections still intact. They met at a small cafe in Berkeley. Ruth told her everything and handed over the USB. Lydia listened carefully, then said, "If released properly, this could shake the entire industry." Ruth replied, "I don't want to start a scandal. I just want to stop the systemic erasure they're planning. Under the guise of data integration." Lydia nodded. "I'll handle it the old-fashioned way. Quiet, but accurate." She promised to pass it to an independent investigative group she trusted. Back at Mercer Labs, Julian realized his mother had left the house and grew anxious. But by the afternoon, Ruth returned, her eyes brighter than usual. She didn't say much, just placed a hand on Julian's shoulder and went into the kitchen to cook stew. Julian knew his mother only made that dish when something big was coming. That night, just before going to bed, Ruth said only one thing. "Tomorrow you should call a full leadership meeting." On Saturday morning, Lydia called. "The piece goes live at 10 a.m. tomorrow. They've authenticated everything. Ashcroft won't be able to sit still." Ruth didn't respond, just pressed her lips together. She knew she had just pulled the trigger, but she also knew there's a time when silence becomes complicity in watching humanity be stripped away behind closed doors. At exactly 10 a.m. on Sunday, an investigative article, nearly 6,000 words long, appeared on the front page of the Chronicle. Inside Ashcroft's empire, profits over patients. Internal documents, meeting recordings, presentation slides, all were made public. What Ruth had seen that night now reached millions. TV networks mentioned Ruth Mercer's name as a symbol of a silent rebellion. The hashtag #, Ruth was right, spread rapidly. Julian read the news with a flood of emotion. He didn't know exactly what his mother had done, but he could feel it. Something had changed forever. At Ashcroft, Maxwell lost control. He hurled his phone against the wall, screaming, "Who leaked this?" "Who?" Preston stayed silent. No one knew where the USB had come from, but a former intern named Connor, who had once copied internal documents for Preston, had abruptly quit the week before. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was someone inside the system who had grown tired of enabling what they no longer believed in. Maxwell roared, "Shut this down! Use the legal team, threaten lawsuits, call the press, tell them it's fake news." But it was too late. The internet doesn't unsee once the truth is seeded. And at Mercer Labs, Ruth was wiping tables in the break room. this time with two younger staff members helping her. One of them, Bianca, a new hire, asked softly, "Ms. Ruth, why are you still working like nothing's changed even though the whole country is talking about you?" Ruth smiled without looking up. "Because I never worked to be talked about. I worked so that what's right wouldn't be forgotten." 3 days after the Profits Over Patients investigation was published, Mercer Labs no longer felt like a place where people clocked in and out without thinking. Something had shifted. A new heartbeat was forming, not in spreadsheets or business plans, but in the way employees looked at each other, spoke, and even remained silent. They began asking questions, not about profit, but about why they were there in the first place. And the person who had sparked that change, Ruth Mercer, continued to show up every morning with her rubber gloves, as if no earth-shaking expose had ever occurred. Julian spent the entire night rereading the investigative report, then combed through Mercer Labs' existing policies. He discovered dozens of blind spots in the operations, gray areas that had once been left flexible under Ashcroft's standards. He decided he could no longer stay silent. On Wednesday morning, Julian called a full leadership meeting to present a new proposal. The first slide bore just one large letter, Revive. He said, "Revive is not a product, it's a promise. It's a declaration that we will no longer allow patients to become targets of business strategy." The Revive proposal consisted of three main pillars: eliminate all systems that classify patients based on ability to pay, establish an independent ethics council, including doctors, janitorial staff, and community representatives each quarter, publicly release case studies of patients treated outside profitability standards to reaffirm humanitarian values. The room was silent. A finance executive asked, "Do you realize what this will do to dividends?" Julian answered immediately without looking at his slides, "I do. But if the price of keeping dividends is abandoning vulnerable patients in the shadows, then I don't want those dividends." He looked every person in the room in the eye. "If you still believe in the old system, I won't stop you from leaving. But if you're ready to rebuild from scratch, then Revive is the door." The meeting lasted 4 hours. In the end, 9 out of 12 signed the implementation memo. The remaining 3, all of whom had worked directly with Ashcroft, requested personal leave to reconsider their future direction. Julian knew they wouldn't return, but he didn't feel regret. He felt relief. For the first time, Mercer Labs was no longer running on fear or market expectations. They were choosing to redefine themselves. The next day, Ruth was invited to serve as honorary advisor to the REVIVE team. She declined any formal title. "I don't want people thinking this is a campaign to honor the cleaning lady. I just want to make sure the next person isn't treated the way I was." Ruth proposed a small idea. Place a mirror on the wall of every meeting room, directly under the phrase, "Does this person deserve to be served?" No one objected. In fact, someone chuckled. It had never occurred to them to look at themselves before making a decision. Meanwhile, Ashcroft faced a firestorm of media backlash and scrutiny from lawmakers. A senator from Massachusetts went on national television. "We cannot let healthcare corporations decide who gets to live and who doesn't." The hashtag number sign, "Patients Not Profit," went viral. Several hospitals announced a suspension of partnerships with Ashcroft pending ethical review. Maxwell Ashcroft responded by blaming internal hostile actors and threatening to sue the leakers. But no one was listening anymore. Revive began rolling out at Mercer Labs. Within 2 weeks, 5 patients who had previously been excluded from treatment for being outside profitability metrics were reinstated. One was a 6-year-old girl with a rare heart condition. Her case had been rejected and returned to her parents because she didn't meet research yield requirements. Now she was receiving full care at no cost. Her father cried when he received the confirmation letter. In it was a handwritten note. "Not everyone is born to be profitable, but everyone is born to be saved." Ruth visited that hospital, not wearing a lab coat, not stating her name. She simply stood in the hallway, watching through the treatment room window. The little girl, with pigtails and bright eyes, was playing with puzzle pieces. Ruth stood there for nearly an hour, saying nothing, doing nothing. When a nurse asked, "Ma'am, can I help you with anything?" Ruth smiled and replied, "No. I just wanted to be sure this world still has hope." A week later, Julian received an email from an international public health organization. They wanted to replicate the Revive model in developing nations, not because they had the funding, but because they had the will. Julian replied, "Revive is not a brand. It's a conscience." He attached all documentation, free of charge. When asked by the media, how is Mercer Labs bold enough to do this while competitors hesitate? Julian answered, "Because we have nothing left to fear. When a woman with a mop can stand up for what's right, we have no excuse to sit down for profit." At the end of the month, Mercer Labs held an all-hands gathering in the ground floor auditorium. For the first time since its founding, the space was packed, from executives to call center staff. There was no speaker on stage, just a screen, playing footage of Ruth wiping down a table, followed by Julian reading an internal letter of apology from the company itself. The room remained silent, no tears, no applause, just something, quietly, being made right. Something small, but deeply human. The boardroom on the 21st floor of Mercer Labs had long been known as the room without mirrors. For 20 years, it was where the most decisive actions had been made. Product strategy, mass layoffs, acquisitions, restructures. None of them ever questioned aloud once the walnut wood doors closed. But this morning, at the far end of the long, cold table, sat someone no one had ever imagined would take a seat. Ruth Mercer. Not as a janitor, not as a media symbol, but as an honorary guest, officially invited by Julian and approved unanimously in last week's internal meeting. Ruth sat in the last chair on the left, 3 seats away from Julian. She carried no laptop, no assistant, and no name placard, just a small gray folder and her old canvas bag. As members of the board filed in, some looked surprised, others nodded as if they had already expected her. But one in particular, Suzette Gray from Strategic Shareholder Relations, glared at Ruth with a look that didn't just say disapproval, but disruption, as if Ruth's presence had fractured the unwritten rituals of power they'd long upheld. Julian stood to open the session. No slides, no spreadsheets, no screen, just words. "We're not here today to calculate profit. We're here to calculate what's left of our conscience." He reported that Revive had been piloted at 5 facilities. Feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. Staff retention rates had improved. Dozens of letters of gratitude had come in from patients. But he didn't sugarcoat the consequences. Operational costs had risen, and dividends might shrink in the next quarter. As he sat down, Suzette raised her hand. "I'm not against kindness," she said coolly. "I'm against turning a healthcare corporation into a charity. If we don't manage costs, who will answer to the shareholders?" Julian didn't blink. "I think the shareholders will be grateful to know we're investing in a future that won't be sued out of existence." Another board member chimed in, "Conscience doesn't pay invoices." Ruth suddenly spoke, without asking permission. "And which invoice pays for the death of a child denied care?" The room fell silent. Suzette leaned slightly toward Ruth, voice sharpened. "I respect your past, but this isn't a place for personal storytelling." Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Instead, she reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a photograph. A boy around 10 years old, with IV tubes in his arms, eyes wide, staring into the camera. "This is Raphael, diagnosed with thyroid cancer, denied access to clinical trials because his father was undocumented. Without Revive, he'd be dead. Would you prefer I print out his hospital bill so we can discuss return on investment?" Julian added quietly, "We're not just saving patients. We're saving our name. If Ashcroft publishes their quarterly profits tomorrow, let them. They'll be buried in lawsuits over ethics. But us, we need to decide. Go forward with Revive or return to the old model." He paused, then said, "I'm calling for a formal vote. Transparent. Now." There were 17 board members, including Julian. Revive needed 12 votes to pass his full system-wide policy. Julian raised his hand first, then the head of HR, then the regional director of the Southwest. By the time the 8th hand went up, the room was already tense. Suzette whispered something to the member beside her. When her turn came, she declared, "I vote no." Several others followed. Total, 9 votes in favor, 6 against, 1 abstention. One hand had yet to rise. It belonged to Charles Yoon, the oldest board member, known for never taking sides. Emotionless, unmoved, entirely neutral. He looked around the room, then turned to Ruth. "I remember you," he said slowly. "You helped me find my ID badge when I dropped it on the fourth floor." Ruth nodded. Charles continued, "I forgot to thank you that day, but I won't forget today." He raised his hand. "I vote yes." The room froze. 10, 11, and then a soft sound, like a whisper against polished wood, as Dr. Ellen laid her palm on the table. She never voted. Ever. But now she said, "Revive isn't perfect, but without it, I can't look my patients in the eye." 12 votes. Revive passed. Julian exhaled. Ruth didn't speak. She simply tightened her grip on the gray folder in her lap. But as the assistant stepped outside to announce the result to the press, something unexpected happened. The large screen at the end of the room lit up. No one had turned it on. A grainy video began to play. At first it was blurry, then it became clear. Maxwell Ashcroft in a private meeting, barking orders to his assistant to remove a patient's name from a registry, to avoid media risk. His voice rang through the boardroom. "If anything goes wrong, blame the junior staff. Always have a scapegoat." Suzette shot to her feet. "Who did this?" Julian turned to Ruth. She didn't speak. She placed a small scuffed USB drive on the table, wrapped in a napkin. "Someone sent it to me. No name. But I thought the board might want to see it before rejecting compassion again." Julian didn't ask further. He turned to legal counsel. "Prepare a statement. This video is going public." Suzette protested. "This is illegal." Ruth's voice was quiet. "What's illegal is voting against your own conscience." The meeting ended in silence. No one rushed to leave. Julian turned to Ruth and for the first time spoke softly. "Thank you for coming." Ruth stood, eyes steady. "I didn't come to be thanked. I came to remind you, there are people like me still scrubbing your floors every day, right beneath your feet." 3 days after the historic board meeting at Mercer Labs, social media and mainstream press simultaneously published the same phrase, the Ruth Protocol. It wasn't issued by the company. It wasn't crafted by PR. It came from a former surgical assistant named Carla, who posted on X with the hashtag dignity over everything. In her post, she recalled a small detail most people had missed in the leaked video. As Ashcroft was loudly shifting blame, a janitorial woman in the background stopped mopping for 3 seconds, silently stood upright, and looked straight into the camera. That was Ruth. She didn't speak. She didn't react. She simply stood there, like a mirror silently reflecting the truth. After Carla's post, a flood of testimonies from Mercer Labs healthcare employees began to appear. An MRI technician, a supply room staffer, a doctor who was once ignored for pushing back against revenue-boosting schemes that cut patient time. They all had one thing in common. They had been silent, and now for the first time, they had a symbol. Julian didn't hold a press conference. He simply sent an internal email titled, "Dignity over Everything." Inside it read, "We can't repair every wrong in our past, but we can begin by listening to the people we once deemed too unimportant to be heard." Within 1 week, Ashcroft was placed on temporary leave pending internal investigation. Investors were initially anxious, but when Revive was cited in media as a radical model of human-centered healthcare, Mercer's stock didn't drop. It inched up. Suzette Gray, the staunchest opponent of Revive, abruptly stepped down from the board without public explanation. In her place, the newly created position of independent ethics overseer was assigned to someone who had never appeared in the media. Ruth. Not in an executive role, not as a spokesperson, but as the dignity liaison. The title sounded odd at first, but was unanimously approved by staff. Her task was to receive anonymous reports from employees, patients, even janitors, sanitation crews, techs, and logistics teams, people who couldn't book meetings with leadership but saw everything the financial statements couldn't capture. By the second week, Ruth began visiting every corner of the system considered marginal. Not the HQ offices, not the boardrooms, but the janitorial break rooms, the medical equipment storage zones, the women's restroom on the fourth floor, where she was once ignored after requesting a new faucet. At every stop, she didn't say much. She asked just one question. Here, what makes you feel disrespected? Then she listened, took notes by hand. No recordings, no cameras. But 3 weeks later, a 112-page dignity ledger was handed to Julian, a reform document not written by consultants, but by real people with real handwriting. One entry told the story of a nursing intern named Naomi, who had once asked a physician for help when a patient fainted, only to be brushed off. Ruth asked, "What did you do then?" Naomi answered, "I caught the patient and apologized to them for letting them fall in front of me." Ruth said nothing. But soon after, Naomi received a personal invitation from Julian to join the Revive Reform team. Gradually, small changes began to ripple outward. At the East Inpatient Wing, each patient visit was extended by 2 minutes. No one was rushed. In the ground floor restroom, the toilet paper was replaced with a softer kind, because a janitor once said, "We can't heal people with roughness." In the night shift break room, a cookie jar appeared every evening with a note, "No shift is invisible." Julian met Ruth one late afternoon as she was coming up from the basement storage room. He asked, "Do you think Revive will be strong enough to survive?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window. It was lightly raining. She said, "If you think it has to be strong, it will be fragile. But if you let it be real, even if it's weak, it will endure." He nodded. "I'll remember that." When Ruth officially assumed her role, there was no ceremony, just a new inbox created with the address ruth.mercer@dignityline.org and a small inscription etched beside her office door, "Every voice matters, even the quietest one." Meanwhile, Ashcroft, from his private residence, continued to file legal claims, insisting he'd been framed. But no one was listening anymore. Those who once supported him began to quietly withdraw. Not because he failed, but because he never understood that no empire can survive on the silence of the disrespected. 1 month later, Ruth visited the Woodbridge Medical Facility, where she had mopped floors for 17 years. The new director welcomed her and offered the head seat. Ruth declined. She chose instead a small plastic chair by the window next to the tea table. When her former co-workers came to greet her, she said, "I didn't come back to be remembered. I came back so no one else would be forgotten." That evening, a short video appeared on Mercer Labs' official YouTube channel. No music, no graphics, just footage of Ruth sitting by the window, light falling on her hand holding a stack of paper. She said, "I used to think dignity was something others gave you, but now I understand. It's something you hold for others, even when they don't know your name." The video ended with one line of text, "Mercer Labs, listening begins here. Dignity over everything." There are people who don't need recognition to be great. They hold no titles, wear no medals, and appear in no headlines. And yet, it is they, through quiet strength, steady patience, and a love that asks for nothing in return, who preserve the dignity of entire systems that have forgotten how to listen. If you've ever been dismissed because of your job, your appearance, or where you came from, if you've ever watched a good person get ignored and silently wondered, does anyone still care? Then today's story is your answer. Ruth is not a CEO, not a founder, not an investor. She's just a woman in rubber gloves who once mopped floors in silence, but made an entire board of directors change course. What do you think about that? Have you ever met someone like Ruth in your life? Leave us a comment below, so we don't just hear you, we can learn from you. And if you believe this world needs more stories of quiet justice, everyday kindness, and unshakable human dignity, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Because who knows, someone who desperately needs hope might be reading your comment right now. Dignity over everything. Shakar's Hidden Boss Stories.